Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming along to this talk. My name is Gus Tugendhat, and I'm the founder of an SME based here in London called Tussell, and we are the market's trusted source of insight into government contracts and expenditure. It was a real pleasure to hear the talk by Kit. I was listening to what it's like doing digital transformation within a borough. What I'm going to talk to you about is, just wait one sec. Perfect, thanks. So hopefully my talk is quite a kind of nice contrast to that. Kit was telling us about what it's like to do digital transformation within a borough. I'm going to try and tell you half a dozen things you might not have known about IT purchasing across local government. And the point of this is to give you perhaps a better sense than you may have at the moment about the kind of depth and breadth of this marketplace, and to help you see your own borough in the kind of wider context of local government IT purchasing. And then also I'll share some kind of growth hacks or some way in which you can use decision support like ours to actually get more value out of your procurement. And when I say more value, I mean more social value and more economic value as well. I think what all of you in this room have in common is that all of you are under pressure to do more with less. And if there's one big budget in your organization, it's procurement. So whether you touch that directly or you are impacted by it, it's the kind of big number that if you can get a kind of 1% saving on, that really does move the needle. And I'm going to share with you a few kind of thoughts. There's no writing. These are all charts, a few charts around how you might be able to get more bang for your buck. So I'm actually going to talk about you and your market, but just so you know I'm not a complete cowboy, I'll just give you kind of 1 minute of context on my company. As I said, we're a London-based startup. I founded the company and have built it from scratch. And but in case you haven't heard of us before, we already do business with many of the top suppliers to government across a range of sectors, especially kind of digital data savvy sectors. And our data is so good and so clean and so useful for decision support that it's used by half a dozen of the biggest local authorities and half a dozen ministerial departments and other bodies to better understand their own procurement, their own spend, and how they can get more value out of it. And if you've ever read a scurrilous article all about a public contract or public expenditure around procurement, look closely and you'll find that 9 times out of 10 that data is actually sourced from us. And how do we get it? It's your data. We take all the open data that you publish as part of the procurement process or as part of your obligation to publish all your expenditures of £500 and above. And we take all of that across the whole of the UK, all layers of government. We put it into a massive blender and we hit frappe and we turn it into something useful and easy that you can use to answer the sorts of questions that you've got. So let me get to what I said. Let me try and tell you half a dozen things you might not have known about the big picture in IT procurement in local government. So we'll start with the IT market landscape. So overall, this chart shows you wider public sector IT spend by year since 2016, or 2018 rather. You can see it's grown each year. It grew quite moderately in the first 3 years of this chart, and then suddenly it got a real shot in the arm on account of the pandemic and the acceleration of the adoption of digital services that, you know, we all kind of understand why the pandemic caused. But far from the market kind of subsiding after year one of the pandemic, it actually locked in those gains. And that's why we think the market has kind of reached a new normal where the wider public sector IT market has undergone a kind of structural increase in size. We also break it down by the main buyer types. And I think one takeaway there is that you can see the local government portion of that go from 20% of the total to about 15%. It doesn't mean it was shrinking in absolute terms. It means it was growing less than the wider public sector. So it's actually been replaced as the second largest source of public sector IT spend by the NHS, which is growing very, very quickly to meet the massive challenge of an aging population and the impact of that on the healthcare system. This chart actually breaks it down into absolute numbers. So I'll kind of, what we kind of call out in the heading is just the really massive growth in ICT spend by the NHS, and indeed by the blue light. The NHS has added 2 billion of spend in IT over that 4-year period. It's grown by more than 130%. Blue light has also grown very rapidly, but from a much smaller base. Local government has added about 200 million of spend over that period. So it's stayed more or less flat during a time when the kind of tide has risen. And that, I think, goes back to my original point. I think that is literally evidence of all of you having to kind of keep your budgets kind of constant or flat when people are, other parts of government are spending quite lavishly. This actually just shows you just that local government IT spend by year. And I've established that it didn't grow much over the period. You can see that, but it is nevertheless a very large market. It was worth 2.3 billion in the year ended March 2022. And it's a very stable or persistent market. So it's a really important budget for all of you, and it's a really important market for your suppliers. And by our figures, it accounts for about 4% of your total procurement budget, though that's drifted down very slightly over the period. Who are the biggest spenders? You can see that here. I don't think there are that many surprises, but maybe some. And it's quite fun to get really inside this data and just to have a look at, people who spend a lot across a small number of suppliers, people who spend a lot, but they've really kind of spread that, people who have a small number of high value contracts or the reverse. So there's all sorts of insights. What I'm showing you here is necessarily high level macro data, but all of it kind of originates in a contract or an invoice that you can click through to in the product. So all of it ultimately is auditable and comes from the information that you are publishing, though with the caveat that it's only as good as what you are publishing. If a lot of your contract awards or your expenditures never see the light of day, then it can't be analyzed by people like us. And it makes you look smaller in the market than you really are. This kind of shifts it around and shows you the supplier side of the equation. And the thing I usually call out on this slide is that ICT spend directly with SMEs has been rising, but there's room for improvement. This only measures the spend directly with SMEs. We can't accurately measure, nobody can accurately measure the indirect spend with SMEs through the supply chain, so via the primes and so on and so forth. But in terms of IT spend by local government directly with SMEs, it's risen from about 13% of the total IT spend to about 17%. So steady improvement, take it, bank it, but I think there's room for improvement. Over that period, the market share of the top 10 suppliers, we didn't do much filtering. The top 10's a bit of a rag bag of resellers, of technology companies, of IT companies and more telcos, but they are just the top 10 over the period. And over that period, their market share has declined a little bit. So there is genuine evidence of more contract disaggregation, of more supply diversification, but I think it could be better. But you are leading. Local government does much, much better than central government on this important SME metric. Then just before we get into ways that you can try and turn these insights into ways of getting more economic and social value out of this enormous budget, the other thing we thought we'd share is just the proportion of total ICT contracts awarded by local government via a framework. And what kind of strikes us is that local government are using ICT frameworks much less than the NHS and less than central government as well. And there's no inherent critique in that. Frameworks have proliferated. They're no longer quite the way of kind of streamlining your procurement and saving money that it might once have been. And using frameworks doesn't necessarily make it easier for you to spend money locally or to spend money with SMEs. But there is a kind of trend here that local government is using them less. And to the extent that that gives you kind of pause for thought or raises a question, then I thought I'd share it. So how can you use decision support from sources like us, but you could use the free data that's out in the market? The important thing is, how can you use decision support to get more bang for your buck out of your own procurement?